Good morning, all you all from State Fair Community College, Boonville, Missouri. Nice, crisp spring day. Not quite 50 degrees yet, and I'm sorry I'm late. However, I was trying to do something a little fancier, and I shut down everything I'd set up. So hopefully, we're going to be back to normal here for the remainder of this little class. So it's been a heavy day for anatomy, another heavy day for physiology. Um, we got to name all the arteries in the body last hour. So we're gonna delve into fructose and high fructose corn syrup this morning. Big problem. We talked about this about 3 months ago. I'm gonna run through this from a different angle. So fructose was developed in about 1972 in Japan, and it was felt for many years until about 2000 to be a pretty benign sweetener because it has a low glycemic index, and we've been talking about the glycemic index and the insulin index. So fructose is the sugar that's found naturally in fruit, but of course it hasn't been processed. It's a natural sugar, and when you eat fruit, raw fruit, you get the fiber along with it. Okay, so as frequently is true, the problem is a matter of scale. So natural fruit consumption contributes small amounts of fructose in the diet, but added sweeteners, especially with sucrose or high fructose corn syrup, so sucrose is table sugar, and then high fructose corn syrup added large amounts of sugar and carbohydrates to the standard American diet. So the peak consumption was about the year 2000. That's when the Atkins Revolution Part 2 started becoming um, looking at fructose and its relationship to obesity. So this is, the low carb, high protein version of the Atkins diet. And so adolescents were found to have a high consumption of fructose and high fructose corn syrup. It's the sweetest naturally occurring carbohydrate, so it's sweeter than table sugar if you think about the fruits that you eat. So what's the problem? So it was developed in the 70s as a liquid sugar equivalent to table sugar. The problem is it's not the 50-50 ratio with sucrose where you have glucose and fructose in a 50-50 ratio. In high fructose corn syrup, fructose is 55%, glucose is 42%, the other 3% are other carbohydrates. And sucrose is processed from sugar cane and sugar beets. So what they found was high fructose corn syrup could be processed much cheaper from the corn that's growing all over the Midwest. Hi Linda, hi Wendy. Okay, so you've got all this corn that's being grown, and so high fructose corn syrup, when it came on the market, was found to be cheap, cheap, cheap compared to processing sugar cane and sugar beets. And so in processed food, high fructose corn syrup was a natural fit. It's liquid. It could be incorporated into any food, and if you look at food labels, you will see that. And they've gotten sneaky as the high fructose corn syrup was found to be linked to obesity and type 2 diabetes. They've changed the labeling from high fructose corn syrup to natural sugars. Well, technically, fructose is a natural sugar, but it's processed from corn. Okay, so it's made its way into everything. It's in pizza sauce, soups, breads, cookies, cakes, ketchup, sauces. Matter of fact, my students, we were just talking about ketchup, which is basically a bad thing to eat. You hear mayonnaise is bad for you because of the cholesterol and the fats, but mayonnaise is made from eggs. Okay, high fructose corn syrup is made from corn, and it's loaded into ketchup. So the advantages didn't stop just because it was a liquid form of sugar. So it's sweeter than glucose, fructose is. It prevents freezer burn. It helps with browning of food. It mixes easily into anything. It extends shelf life, and it keeps bread soft and softer than just sugar. All right, so it's cheap. So companies cared more about that than almost anything else. So it's cheap to make, it's cheaper to make than table sugar. So since high fructose corn syrup and sucrose um, were similar, most didn't expect any significant differences between them. Plus, it was inexpensive to make. So food manufacturers went all over high fructose corn syrup and started adding it to everything in place of table sugar. And then in 2004, a guy named George Bray published a study that kind of threw the brakes on this. He showed that there's an increase of obesity that was mirrored by the rise in the use of high fructose corn syrup. At the same time, there was a significant decrease in the use of table sugar, which was more expensive than high fructose corn syrup. So basically, high fructose corn syrup was replacing the more expensive refined sugar in the diet, the standard American diet. So really, the rise in obesity rates mirrored the increase in the use of sugar, whether that was 55% fructose in high fructose corn syrup or the 50% fructose in table sugar, apparently did not make that much difference. So the problem was really the use of high fructose corn syrup with that change in the ratio. So the outcome of this furor was the increased scrutiny of the dangers of excess fructose, and that continues to this day. Okay, researchers started looking at the differences between glucose and fructose, and it turns out there's a lot of them. So glucose can be used in every cell in your body. Your body knows what glucose is. Okay. Certain cells can only use glucose, whether you eat that or whether you make that in your own systemic circulation in your body. So red blood cells are cited as only being able to use glucose. Skeletal muscles in need of quick and accessible energy will preferentially consume glucose, but every cell in your body has the ability to use glucose. However, there is no cell in the body that has the ability to use fructose for energy source. Okay, so studies into absorption of fructose showed that free fructose is poorly absorbed in the human gut. However, the presence of glucose, which is in high fructose corn syrup, significantly increases the amount of fructose that's absorbed from the diet. And so where glucose uses insulin for absorption, fructose does not. It doesn't even pay attention to insulin. So most cells do not take up fructose, and it is really only metabolized in the liver. Okay, so glucose can be dispersed through your whole body for use as energy. Fructose is a guided missile toward your liver. And so I put up a picture of what happens to your liver with high fructose corn syrup. It becomes fatty. So in the liver, fructose is rapidly turned into fructose 1-phosphate, and there's no limit to that reaction. So there's no rate limiting step. Okay, so when an excess of glucose is eaten, the body has a natural rate limiting step that prevents excessive overloading of the metabolic system with glucose. There is no such system for fructose. It can just continue to be concentrated in the liver and altered. So the more you eat, the more you metabolize of fructose. So this becomes glucose, lactate, and glycogen, all concentrated in the liver. And with higher levels of fructose ingestion, it then turns into acetylcoenzyme A, which is needed for fatty acid synthesis. And so what this means is that excessive fructose becomes fat in the liver, or fatty liver. So high levels of fructose ingestion creates fatty liver. So this fatty liver is crucial in the development of insulin resistance in the liver. So insulin is normally released when we eat. It directs glucose to be stored as energy for later use when we're not eating, or it's used immediately in short term. Some of that is stored as glycogen. That can, once you need more glucose, glycogen can be reversed. Remember, glycogen is just a long string of glucose. But then the rest, once you've made your glycogen, the rest of the glucose, if it's not being immediately used, needs to be stored as fat. So insulin promotes the production of fat in the liver, which is known as de novo lipogenesis. Lipo, fat, genesis, creation. So making fat that's new. So it's the process of turning glucose into fat, and insulin is the hormone that pushes food energy into storage. So takes it out of the bloodstream, puts it into the liver, or it's disseminated to cells in your body that are using it right at that time. If it's not being used, it's converted to glycogen and then into fat. So when the insulin level is low, when you're fasting and you're not eating, the process reverses. So glycogen is broken down into glucose. That's called glycogenolysis. And then fat that's been stored is degraded for energy. So you're basically eating your own fat. That's the point of fasting. So if you have balanced feeding periods with fasting periods, then there's not a net fat gain. There's not a net amount of fat that's gained. And then if your fasting becomes longer, you actually break down fat and use it for energy, since you're not eating and you're not getting glucose because you're fasting. Okay? So what happens if there's an overinflation? So what if the liver, which stores some fat, is crammed full of fat already? So insulin is trying to cram more fat into your liver that's already full of fat. So just as it's more difficult to inflate an overinflated balloon, insulin has a harder time trying to shove energy into a liver that's already contains a lot of fat. So it takes higher and higher levels of insulin to move the same amount of sugar into a fatty liver, and that's insulin resistance. So the body's now resistant to the effect of insulin, and normal levels of insulin will not be able to push sugar into the liver. The other problem with an overcrammed fatty liver is that it takes high levels of insulin all the time to keep the sugar and fat bottled up in the liver. So if insulin levels start to drop, then sugar comes out, glycogenolysis, just like in an overinflated balloon. So that leads to higher levels of blood sugar, which the body doesn't like and will try to oppose with even higher insulin levels. So in other words, insulin resistance leads to higher insulin levels, which leads to more insulin resistance. So high insulin levels is encouraging storage of sugar and fat into the liver, which causes even more cramming of fat into the liver, causing more insulin resistance. And then you have the vicious cycle that leads to type 2 diabetes and obesity. So this is only true at the liver. So skeletal muscles have normal levels of insulin sensitivity, as well as the brain and the hypothalamus. Fructose differs significantly from glucose because fructose is 100% metabolized in the liver. Okay? So fructose is all directed at the liver, and fructose causes fatty liver, and fatty liver causes insulin resistance. So insulin resistance leads to higher insulin levels, and we know from the hormonal theory of obesity that insulin levels drive obesity, right? So we've been talking about that for a couple weeks. So fructose is developing insulin resistance in fatty liver, which is creating more fatty liver, which is creating more higher insulin levels, which is causing weight gain and then obesity and type 2 diabetes and more insulin resistance. So going back to 1980, there were studies linking the use of fructose but not glucose to the development of insulin resistance in human beings. Okay, so there was a study that examined the effect of adding 100 kilocalories a day of excess calories as glucose versus fructose in healthy young people. Body weight over the duration of the test did not change either group. So intravenous insulin was injected into the subjects. Okay, and these were young and healthy people. So they were given insulin IV after an overfeeding period, and then blood glucose was measured. So the group with excessive glucose intake did not show any statistical difference in sensitivity to insulin. The fructose group, however, showed a 25% worsening of their insulin sensitivity after just 7 days. So both groups had been overfed by the same amount of calories Okay, and fructose also caused a decrease in the binding of insulin to cells, and this paralleled the increase in insulin resistance. A more recent study showed pretty much the same effect. So normal healthy subjects were overfed glucose. So de novo lipogenesis, or the production of new fat in the liver, increased sixfold, accompanied by a 79% increase in plasma triglycerides. That was from 2014. The first study we talked about 5 minutes ago was from 2004, where they started looking at fructose as the problem. And then a measure of insulin resistance in the liver in this fructose group increased by 28%. That was just after 6 days in that study. And then muscle insulin resistance wasn't changed at all. So insulin resistance is a hallmark of type 2 diabetes. So you have previously healthy people who are now well on their way to developing type 2 diabetes in just 6 days. So insulin resistance in 6 days. And then there's another study, even scarier. Here, healthy subjects were given 25% of their daily calories as Kool-Aid, sweetened with either glucose or fructose for 8 weeks. Okay, so that seems like a high percentage, but there's plenty of people that consume that much sugar in their diets every day, whether that be table sugar or high fructose corn syrup. So the oral glucose tolerance test, which we use in pregnant women, is a standard test for gestational diabetes and prediabetes, as well as for people that aren't pregnant. I was an obstetrician, so I think about gestational diabetes. So the blood sugar is measured in response to a 50-gram load of a sugary drink. Okay, the fructose, but not the glucose group, has already developed prediabetes. So this is supported by the finding that the fructose group has developed significantly more insulin resistance than the glucose group. Okay, so you're doing a glucose tolerance test on somebody that's already insulin resistant. Okay, and then insulin levels also significantly higher in the fructose group of this study, all despite the fact that both groups were given equal caloric amounts of glucose versus fructose. So the fructose, furthermore, had much less effect on the blood glucose since it has a low glycemic index. So that's just another reason that the glycemic index does not give you what you need to know. It's the insulin index. So first, the amount of fructose is higher than most people consume, not all. The study was only for 8 weeks. So what's going to happen after decades of high fructose consumption by the standard American diet? So fructose specifically will lead to fatty liver, insulin resistance, obesity, and eventually type 2 diabetes. But they accompany, so that concern is because high insulin levels, remember your fatty liver is elevating insulin levels, which is then causing more insulin resistance, and that leads to obesity. Okay, so the key driver to obesity is increased insulin levels. So it depends on a balance between dietary factors, so particularly refined or fattening carbohydrates, and then the protective factors of fiber in your diet, and we talked about vinegar a couple of days ago. And then another key driver of insulin levels is the time-dependent effect of insulin resistance. So you get the vicious cycle where high insulin levels increase insulin resistance, which leads to high insulin levels. And then the longer this vicious cycle's in play, the worse it becomes. Okay. So fructose also plays a key role in the development of insulin resistance aside from high levels of insulin. Okay, from induction of fatty liver and liver insulin resistance. So from here, it's easy to see why sugar is so fattening. Sucrose is a 50-50 mix of glucose and fructose. High fructose corn syrup is 55% fructose and 47% glucose. The glucose in the mixture acts as a refined carbohydrate and stimulates insulin. The fructose acts on the liver to produce insulin resistance in the liver. So the sugar is stimulating insulin production both in the short term and in the long term. And over time, Chronic overconsumption of sugar leads to high insulin levels, and high insulin levels lead to obesity and type 2 diabetes. So sugars aren't simply empty calories, they're refined carbohydrates. They've had their fiber stripped off of off of them. Okay, they stimulate insulin release and higher insulin levels, as well as insulin resistance. So there's not that much difference between table sugar and high fructose corn syrup. Okay, so they're both bad for you. One may be slightly more bad, but they're both bad. Okay, bottom line, if you want to avoid weight gain, cut sugar out of your diet completely. Don't replace them with sweeteners, and that's a whole other class, is the aspartame group and the saccharin group. But they're just as bad for you. Matter of fact, a study 2 years ago, I think, showed that just drinking more than one diet soda increases your mortality rate from all causes by 40%. Just one a month. One a month. Okay. So the increased consumption of sugar doesn't fully explain the paradox of the Asians who use significant amounts of carbohydrates in their diet, and they had 1% obesity rates and 1% type 2 diabetes rates until they started using high fructose corn syrup and drinking soda. And then it soared, 1,100% increase. So the next thing we need to consider is wheat in the diet. And that's coming up next for tomorrow. So we're about 20 minutes. And I'm going to hop off here and get ready for physiology class. And we're discussing these issues in physiology because we're doing the gastrointestinal system physiology today at 11. So that's it for today. It's nice and sunny. It's supposed to be 63. Enjoy your day wherever you're at, and have a great night. I'll see you tomorrow. Tomorrow's Wednesday, and it depends on whether or not I'm teaching at the high schools and as to when we have class here at Facebook. So if you need help with this, or if you got questions, shoot me a comment, shoot me a message. Go on the website at healthwithout.risk.com if you want me to help you with all this, because you can get sugar out of your diet. It is addictive. It takes about 3 weeks, but you can get through it. So I will talk to you tomorrow, and have a great afternoon. See ya. Bye.